So what can we charge a tenant in terms of a lease? And the calculation or computation of rent is normally a big one that people have a lot of questions over, because there's some things they feel they can include and some things they can't. Now, in commercial leasing, it's very different, because there the landlord charges for absolutely everything, no questions asked. So in residential leasing, there's certain charges or penalties that one shouldn't be charging. And obviously how one computes the rental also comes into consideration. So the first thing that I have to mention is, remember what you charge the tenant as rental, whatever it might be. So whether it's one bulk sum that includes everything, or whether you take it into a bunch of separate little charges, it's pretty much the same thing. That's the reality. It's what the tenant is paying to stay on the property. Now, the reason why it's so important that we do break it down into smaller little charges is a tenant will want to pay for the water that they've consumed or the electricity that they've consumed. So sometimes you'd undercharge by having it as a fixed fee, and sometimes you'd overcharge by having it as a fixed fee. So things like prepaid meters are ideal in situations like that, because it's fair. You measure. And the one little piece of advice I have with things like prepaid meters, especially with electricity, is don't forget to include common areas, especially multi-lets. But there are provisions, and the prepaid meter, not the supplier, but the service provider, will actually guide you and say, look, you can't charge too much, but how much more or less would you say that unit comprises the entire property and the common area? And you go about 5%, because I have another 10 people, and they will actually add 5% charge to the electricity that's bought, and that's good. That's good, because at least then you're recovering actual cost, and there is nothing wrong with that. Because at the end of the day, electricity being consumed in the unit, electricity being consumed out the unit should be paid for by the tenant. Rental is the use of the unit, the actual occupation and enjoyment of the unit. So all these charges kind of play a part there. But now this is where it starts getting complicated, is what about property rates? What about waste removal? What about sanitation? And because it doesn't seem as easy, I mean, are those being consumed? Can one charge for them? Again, in commercial leasing, absolutely. In commercial leasing, the landlord carries those property rates on to the tenant and says, look, you're contributing towards the property rates. This is less common in residential property. You normally factor these into the rent. So yes, they are actually paying for it, but you're not doing it as a separate charge. You're not prorating it. You factor it into the rent. So property rates I don't very often see in residential leases. Sanitation, always in residential leases, because like water is consumed, sanitation works along with the water usage, so sanitation is normally taken into account. So that leaves other small little levies potentially, and things like waste removal. Now, there is nothing wrong with carrying these costs on to the tenant, right? And the way that we sometimes distinguish or have a conversation around this is what costs are associated with occupation and which costs are associated with ownership. Now, it's not necessarily the right way of looking at it, because whichever way you put it, you can potentially charge, but it's a nice just way of kind of asking the question in a very basic way, and even justifying to the tenant to say, well, you know what, waste removal, you are there's waste removal, you're using the bins, it's a charge that you should have to pay for. With property rates, it's a bit less justifiable, and there has been a history where people have argued to say, well, property rates is actually a tax that's paid by the owner of the property, and because the owner is actually liable to pay the property rates, they're the ones responsible for it. So you factor it into the rent. Simple as that. Other levies, again, they have to be specific. So I would look at each specific levy. I'd look at the lease agreement just to see what it says. And if the lease agreement is quiet, either factor it into the rent if you're unsure and it relates too much to ownership, factor it into the rent. Otherwise, include it in the lease agreement specifically. But to my knowledge, there is no case law that does not allow the inclusion of a specific charge. But again, it really does depend on the conversation between the landlord and the tenant.